it looks like we can move on to the next question, which is, what are your questions about development-ready communities? And we are recording this, so we have it online, but for the sake of our time and yours, if you could put that in the chat box to everyone as well, that would be great. Also happy to sort of start the dialogue if anybody wants to kick us off with a question while everybody else can get going on theirs. For those who have just joined, we're just doing a few introductory questions before we begin. One of them being is, did you read the Development Ready Communities document? And the second one is, what are your questions about Development Ready Communities? Yeah. So anybody want to kick us off with a question? Thought?
Do you want us to write our questions or say them?
I'd like, yes, write the questions, and then if you have one right now, I'd love to hear it aloud so we can just start the conversation.
I have one. I was starting to write. I'll start. I think this is exciting, and I love so much of it. My biggest concern that I see where there could be a lot of pushback is on the public engagement process, because often, well, it looks like a lot of it is one way, where, you know, notifying people and having postcards and state of the art, one directional engagement. And I did see the part about charrettes and other mechanisms to gather feedback, but I'm not clear on the timing of that. And will the public feel like, will there be pushback on this whole process because the public feels like they don't have the ability to respond on a case-by-case basis? So that's my question.
Great. That's great. I'm just taking some notes. So we have a question from Ken as well. I'm just going to read them aloud when they come in. What are the benefits for becoming a development-ready community? And then Jane, to respond to your question, I think Jim is asking, what is meant by case-to-case?
Case by case. Oops. Yeah. So, and I may have skimmed it too briefly and not absorbed it enough. But my understanding is that when a community is classified, I guess, or whatever, as development ready, that I guess maybe I need clarification. Does each individual development proposal still go through the same level of a scrutiny that it does today? And I assume the answer is no, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing this. So by the public. So case by case means development by development, or proposal by proposal. And unless I'm missing something, and I could be, so please clarify and set me straight.
So I think what we're going to do is go through the questions, and then that'll sort of provide Kara with discussion points going forward. So any other questions that people want to raise right now?
So I think I have a hard time following along with speaking, looking, and typing questions and thinking. So that just might be my brain. But I think that it might be valuable to just do an overview, because unless I'm the only newish person to this, I think it might be helpful, as Ben suggested, to provide a little bit of context. So, most of us have read through this, but maybe not entirely processed it. Is there an opportunity to take a couple minutes to make a overarching pitch?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. These questions are actually helpful to get me in the right frame of mind. So I know at least what some of you are thinking about or what your initial reactions were having reviewed it, but I will do a kind of a broad run through of what's in the document for those who didn't get a chance to read it, and for those who might benefit from just hearing it versus reading it. So
we have another question. Is this an iterative process of development, and how is it different than what's happening now? Ian, you have any questions?
I don't have any. Well, I have a lot of questions. I think so. As I understand what this is an alternative to. I was trying to frame this properly, but pork barrel distribution of funds. And then I think the second question that or comment that I had related to this was, do the criteria add up to something that lends to a better way of distributing funds? And so those are, so that that's what I understand this to be. I agree with the concept. I think it's important to have criteria so that, what we're doing at a state level, as I'm reading through this and understand it, is that, the scant amount of resources that are available aren't just distributed across the state with no efficacy. So being able to demonstrate a return on investment. But as I read through the criteria for how that gets done, I notice, as working for the city of Sanford, in the first, under the first criteria or the demonstration or whatever, the priority development areas, I noticed that it was said downtown as number 1 on page 4, and it says groupings of 20 more contiguous commercial properties that include multi-story properties. I'm not even sure, a population size for Sanford of 20,000 people, being, one of the 7 largest municipalities in the state, would meet that first criteria as a downtown, and then traditional corridor. So I was just going through on some of these, and I appreciate the comment on public participation, but that's something that we all struggle with. And then, as we work through our comprehensive plan revisions here locally, we definitely don't have, there's just some things that are popping up for me, is that we haven't reviewed our comprehensive plan in the last 5 years. So that's not something, that would meet our level of criteria. And I would say that we are a development ready community because we're benefiting from the DOT planning partnership initiative right now. So we've demonstrated to the DOT that through, at least through that program, that we are development ready, because we have coordinated all of our projects, capital plan, and all these other pieces. And at least under that program, we are doing what we're supposed to be doing. So
Okay.
I don't know, I don't have an answer there, but I'm just pointing out that I don't even know if the criteria that we have, whether we qualify. And so I think that's important to make sure that we adequately qualify places that are development ready.
Yeah. Okay, great. A question from Shelley. We have, looks like this would only apply to communities that have invested a lot of time and money into planning. Towns that don't have zoning, don't have the resources to regularly update their comp plan, or don't have much changing, so there isn't a need to update the plan, would not be eligible. With funding cuts regularly happening to regional planning, rural communities or poor communities are at a disadvantage. So it's also helpful for everybody on the call to think about why you came to the webinar and what you hope to get out of this. Obviously that's a kind of different type of question, but here we got, can you explain how some of the places will not fit the definitions of priority place types? And then there's role of regional perspective and organizations in defining criteria or determining if they've been satisfied. So more concerns related to Shelley's earlier. Overall, the criteria are not something most rural Maine towns can even begin to address. And would it make sense to classify this as an urban program? Question from Misty, how did Michigan address their rural areas with their program? Can we ask the state to support municipalities in creating development-ready communities in ways that will provide timely help to small businesses in downtown districts? It would be easier to make this work if elected officials understand it and it's promoted and supported by the state or COGS. State funding / mandate would help too. And then, sorry, this chat box is difficult to navigate. We've got a note from Jim. If Sanford is development ready, then review under the criteria should be a snap. From Rod, could the priority areas be pre-identified and mapped by the state? Kara, I think we've got a good chunk. I mean, how do you feel? Is she frozen?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, these are great. This is helpful.
Sorry, just on the public participation, reminding me, it was what tonight. You can tune in to our live stream. We have our public meeting through the Planning Partnership Initiative through Maine DOT. So that's part of this, and I'm curious to see how many people through Zoom actually do engage in a public process that we've marketed very broadly.
I will say from the DOT perspective, the Zoom public meetings that we've had thus far since this pandemic has happened, we've actually seen an increase in public involvement, which is great. I mean, that's what I do in planning. I plan a lot of public meetings for 2 people to show up. I'm mostly in rural areas, I'm not in urban. But it's been really great, and we've had lively discussions. So I think it's a great way for people to realize that it is an option, and people in rural communities will buy in. I know a lot of people I work with have had reservations, but it seems to be working out well.
It's great to hear.
I have some thoughts I'd like to share.
Go for it.
So yeah, Ian's description of the process of resource allocation as currently being pork barrel, I think is fair in some ways, but also it kind of caught my ears because those allocations are an outcome of a democratic process. And so it's very, very important, I think, to find a nice balance between empowering the technicians and empowering the technical professionals to engage in resource allocation versus taking power away from the process of democracy, which is an outcome of the electoral mandate of the people. And I will say, as a government official and as somebody who watches the federal process very closely, one of the problems that the federal process has right now is the inability to allocate funding according to the democratic process. Right now, because there is no ability to earmark federal funding, the mandate of the people, as demonstrated by the composition of Congress, is unable to resource allocate according to a democratic outcome. And so by eliminating earmarks, we got rid of a lot of pork in the federal system, but we also disempowered our elected representatives to allocate federal resources and also to have to develop political consensus, which helped to keep the system moving forward. So I think it's very, very important for us when we think about why citizens become disengaged with process and why citizens don't believe that democracy produces the outcomes that they desire. it's very important for us to remember that disconnecting their tax dollars from their elected representatives' desires and their elected representatives' wills is one of the moments where we produce some danger in the system. And so I say this from an analytical perspective at the local level, and I say it from an analytical perspective at the federal level. And I would also, with my experience living, I lived for many, many years in Europe. In Europe, this is a major problem with the disconnect between citizens and the European Union, and the fact that the European Union runs almost entirely based on technical criteria and allocates resources almost entirely based on technical criteria. And there's a feeling of people that they're disconnected from their funds and their money and their revenues and so forth. So one of the good things about Maine is that we stay connected to our democracy. And I just would encourage balance, and I would encourage seeing the resource allocation as a result of an elected process as being significant to democracy.
Cool. That's great. I think there's a couple more questions here. Well, just one more.
Yeah, this is Jim's response to Misty. Misty's question, oh, I can get it. How did Michigan address their rural areas with their program? And Jim says, place types were identified, first of all. Second, rural is defined as exactly that and not suburban. 3, rural towns should have rural plans with zoning supporting only limited development with minimal infrastructure needs. And 4, ag development resources are directed to those rural areas specified and certified as such.
Okay. So thanks for those questions. That it helps to get a little bit of context on what people are thinking after a first read. So I'll, at this point, share my screen. Just after, I'll just give a little bit of an overview for some people who are very new before I do that though. So starting in August, we began talking about how to address a lot of systematic challenges that the state has been talking about and largely have been getting discussed in kind of isolated silos. And we were trying to figure out how to bring all of the land use topics and recommendations and ideas into one broader conversation. And also trying to figure out how to align with the work of the Climate Council, the Housing Affordability Task Force, transportation funding conversations, economic development conversations, all these things that were happening, and really recognizing that the land use kind of piece, the connective tissue between all those things is incredibly critical, and that, you know, it seems like a lot of times towns are being asked to piecemeal address issues, and we wanted to take a step back and see if there is a strategy to align state funding goals and local funding goals in sort of a cohesive development focused program that was less focused on planning and more focused on outcomes. And so that's where this this idea kind of originated, and we've been looking at some of the work that's coming out of these various state efforts and trying to incorporate what we can, although we're kind of at the beginning of that process and looking for a lot more critique from folks who are working on those various initiatives. So at this point, this is, you know, a draft framework for how to tie state funding with some of the objectives related to climate change, economic development, housing, environment. And I'll just switch over to the screen share so we can start to walk through the document. if I can do this. 1 minute. Okay. Second, I'm just gonna stick it on presentation mode here. Okay. Maybe. Can everyone see that? Does that work? Okay, great. So generally, again, the idea is to align the state priorities and funding with projects that are identified by communities. So I think going back to George's comment, you know, this is really meant to provide top-down support for bottom-up ideas, and really try to connect funding resources with projects that will help local communities accomplish their goals and really support their local economies. And so in kind of in light of where we are right now, it seems like this kind of program could be really critical to help, you know, jumpstart the economy in our communities that have seen a lot of disinvestment, or even in parts of communities that have seen disinvestment while, you know, other parts have been growing. And, you know, that gets back to this focusing theme throughout this document. You may have noticed is really trying to understand return on investment for various development models, and making sure that our state and local investments are aligned with projects that have a positive return on investment. So just go to, oh, and you can see here this was added, but these are some of the state level initiatives that are underway that we're trying to follow and see what can be incorporated into this. So again, there's a cohesive set of recommendations and standards and for municipalities. So it's not this piecemeal laundry list of things our towns are being asked to do with limited resources. So this first page is really just trying to explain what needs to happen at the state level to make a program of this type go. There's, you know, a focus on place-based criteria here, and again, getting projects that are development ready, identified at the local level, projects that have a positive return on investment, that, you know, have elements of walkability, reducing carbon, those kind of goals for all age levels, broad range of housing, and you know, activities that support the rural economy is also a piece of this. So we are trying to fold in as much as we can related to rural places. So recognizing that not every town has a downtown, and that there needs to be solutions for rural communities, or access for rural communities to these resources. And so I think there are a couple of comments about, you know, how are towns going to be able to go through this program, and it really would be contingent on the state providing technical assistance from the beginning to do a lot of the work that's included in here. So that's on the yellow side over here. You can see that there's work that has to happen related to the management of the program, and then planning, working with the communities to go through some of the work that needs to happen in order to qualify for funding. And then on the development side, you know, once you've got your local ideas at the community level in place, the state would need to help support some places that don't have the capacity to make projects advance through the process and get them into the hands of local developers. And then, you know, we've also started talking too about the financial end of the program, which, you know, there's already some existing state programs in place that have funding streams that towns are taking advantage of. But I'm sure, as most of you who work in communities know, that there's gaps in funding for new construction of small scale projects that aren't affordable, for example, and other types of projects that just don't fit neatly into existing funding buckets. So we've been talking about other mechanisms to create funding for actual projects, whether they're, you know, buildings or whether it's infrastructure. There's funding mechanisms that are out there. So we're starting to dig into that, whether it's a FAME type structure, or, you know, private dollars or foundation money. So we're looking at that. And if anyone wants to get more involved in that conversation, please let me know. And oops, sorry. And so the other big idea here is that, you know, the state gets organized in terms of streams, and the funding really gets targeted towards areas that meet these priority development area criteria. And those would be defined by the state. And this is just at this point a proposal on what those places look like. But the idea is that most communities, all communities across the state, should have these kinds of places within their town boundaries. And so locally, the town would determine where the boundaries for these different areas are and what the priorities are within each community. And then the towns would identify projects within the priority development areas that they've laid out. And those are the projects that they would either then put out for the private development community, local investors to take advantage of, or, you know, they might submit a project to the state for funding. And so this is, again, this is a first pass at trying to identify the kinds of places that have a positive return on investment, that meet, you know, those kind of goals for where people want to see the bulk of investment made in their community. So everyone should read those very carefully and think about it with the context of various types of communities across the state in mind, to see if these are the right kind of places. And then just moving on into the next section.
I need glasses.
Does someone have a question?
No, I think it was background.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the next section of pages are the actual criteria. And the idea is that in order to gain access to state funding and, you know, investment dollars for projects within the priority development areas, you would have to meet baseline criteria that are listed in this section. And then there might be additional criteria that contribute to scoring. And so that differentiation hasn't happened yet between baseline and scoring criteria. And I think some of your comments that you've made earlier about, you know, most rural towns couldn't manage this set of criteria is probably true, and even with technical support. So the question really that we need to get into is which of these criteria really are truly baseline, where it's a minimal standard that you need to meet, and which ones are would weigh into helping score, so you might have a better position to gain funding. So the first section of criteria is really on comp planning and capital improvement planning. I think there's a broader conversation about comp planning that's happening right now with regard to whether our current comp planning rules are what we need at this point in time to really triage where we're at in the world. And whether, you know, we might be able to move toward a more targeted approach to comp planning, more strategic, that's focused again on not just doing planning, but really planning for the sake of getting projects happening and investment happening in communities. And so I think the criteria here provide a glimpse at how comp planning could be reframed to really focus on investment and place-based investment, instead of sort of an exhaustive analysis of what a community is doing at a certain point in time. And so, you know, again, this is looking at where do you want your community to grow? What do you want that to look like? Identifying those priority development areas, and then really getting into the weeds with the public on what should happen in those areas. What should development look like? What kind of uses and activity are people looking for? How should the infrastructure be improved to support those kind of activities? And you know, what funding might be available? You know, there's a whole list here of things that kind of all feed back into that idea of how do we get projects to happen in the way that local people want to see them happen.
And we have Kara, we have a comment from Jane.
Yep.
Similar idea was part of the Gateway 1 process in the Mid-Coast a decade ago. The idea was to allow communities that integrate land use and transportation decisions, and then the Mid-Coast would have the authority to distribute non-emergency transportation dollars like an MPO does now. Towns were divided into low, medium, and high ability, capability, and staff, and low, medium, and high, oh, I went to the top, oh no, sorry. Low, medium, and high need. It might be worth looking at again. So it's possible there's some precedent.
Yeah, no, I think the Gateway 1 process is an interesting case study. And people who were involved in the heyday and the demise hopefully can provide more insight into all of that, because I was viewing it from afar. Great. So moving on, this is the public participation piece that a few people mentioned. I think that the idea here is, you know, to help encourage communities to get more people involved in the process of, you know, going through the comp plan, updating the comp plan and the zoning. And to answer, I think it was Jane's question from earlier, I think the idea is to try to front load engagement so that people are participating in the active visioning and then doing the work of aligning the zoning to the visioning. But that if there are, you know, sites that are contentious, what this says is that, you know, basically go back to the community and work it out. Like there's still ideally would be public process in advance, and then when you get to the detailed level of you know, advancing projects. But that also, you know, if something is not contentious, that if basically the majority or a lot of people are in agreement about what should happen on a particular site, then those kind of projects can be approved administratively. So it's not sort of a black and white kind of situation, but it's more of a, you know, if there is agreement, make it easier for people to get the approvals. And if it's controversial, then continue to work with people to arrive at a place where there's less controversy. So hopefully that answers that question. In terms of zoning, the idea here is to really take the vision from the comp plan process and then change the zoning to reflect the kind of places that people have indicated they want. Simplify the zoning so that you're really only regulating what you need to accomplish the vision. And trying to think what else is important from the zoning. Yeah, there's some standards in here about how to increase access to housing and more flexible housing. So we are allowing people to have accessory units and a mix of different building types, transportation options, parking standards, which impact everything. And so these are meant to be sort of the key criteria for what we should be seeing in zoning codes if people are going to be really truly development ready. And so people should look at these and see if these are the right set of standards. It also includes financial standards. So you know, this is trying to get people to think more about the life cycle counting and value per acre, and making sure that we are prioritizing projects that have a positive return. Is there a question?
I think it's a bit of feedback.
Okay. Development review. This is about the process.
Oh, wait, sorry. Sorry, there are some comments. So Elizabeth has said parking standards should have some provision for bike parking. It's needed almost everywhere and could be an alternative to car share parking in smaller towns where car share isn't available. And then George says, in my eyes, this would be an example of conflict between a democratic outcome and the requirements of technical specifications. Rumford does not have any zoning, and this as a director that is a direct result of the will of the people. Under this model, we would be penalized for not having zoning, even though that it is directly because it's how the people of the town feel it should be.
Yeah, fair point. And I guess I would ask you how this could be modified to reflect that, because I think that's a real situation. And so maybe there's, you know, a different criteria that is in lieu of all these other zoning related ones for communities that do have zoning. So I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I hear you on that, and we'll need to think more about how to address that, but that's a good point. All right, so on development review, this is really just the processes, making sure it's clear for potential investors, developers, how the process should work so that people can get projects built efficiently and get them moved through the process. So I think anyone who has experience with this world should definitely look closely at these standards. And again, some of these are, you know, more appropriate to communities that have resources than those who don't. So I think there needs to be a little bit of differentiation here between the baseline and the scoring criteria, or, you know, maybe it's for different types or sizes of communities. So it's an outstanding question there.
So Jane suggests, she wonders if a set aside for non-zoning towns and zone towns, i.e. 2 pots of funding, would help. She doesn't know the actual numbers, but would guess hundreds of towns have no zoning. That would be an interesting fact to check. And then Jim has suggested change the phrase zoning to development regulations. Sort of semantics, but helpful. And zoning is one form of regulation. George has said, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that we should start splitting state funding based on towns that elect to have zoning standards versus not. George, you wanna elaborate?
Yeah, I just think that it's very important not to start creating classes or tiers of towns and start splitting off funding. I think it's very important to understand that these kind of technical specifications really are going to give a lot of leverage to communities that are much wealthier, that have the ability to pay to have the administrative burden of technical standards and specifications in place. In larger towns, Ian is a good example of places like that. They can afford to handle the technical and administrative burden. In smaller towns, they simply cannot afford to pay for administration of a lot of these technical standards, which is why they don't have them. In the very smallest towns, they can't even afford to pay for code enforcement, which is why in the towns around us, for example, we have a lot of code issues in the towns around Rumford because they can't even afford to do code enforcement, let alone good planning. So I think that if we get into this where the state funding starts to flow towards places that have these really, really well done plans, we're going to see state money going into wealthier communities fundamentally. And I think that's something that we want to try and avoid, obviously.
So there's a flurry of chats. Jim says it's critical to see this as not geographically focused, but place focused. And Ian suggests to support George's position, poor planning is worse than no planning. And Jim says that's why states should get into the business of financially supporting their locals to build systems. Yeah, Ian mentioned that Sanford would struggle to meet these standards. Yeah, and that there's only a limited amount of money. I mean, Jim, can you speak to how Michigan has dealt with this size problem of communities and resourcing between them?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me? Everybody can hear me? Is that right? Yeah. Okay, good.
Yep.
Okay. I think to make a system like this work, the state must recognize that it has a fiduciary responsibility to support communities that may not have the necessary capacity to engage. Here, that was recognized early on, and funding through, by the way, the regional planning councils was supported or has been undertaken to provide a base level of process and tactics, tactic structure to set them up to go. I think the other side of this, that fulcrum that Kara showed earlier is a really important fulcrum. No matter how you slice it, the state or either itself or through pass-through of the feds only has a limited war chest of dollars to spend on projects. So the question is, and the need for shifting from a spread the butter approach, which has been traditionally the focus of a state or federal formula programs, to a targeted approach is critical, because to spread the butter is found to be problematic in terms of not achieving outcomes across multiple geographies because there's not enough dollars to go around. So being efficient and targeted in investment while providing the opportunity for locals to get ready and in a ready position to do that work in targeted scale, that's a key philosophic construct behind this whole process, or at least the process we have been running here. And as I've been reading what Kara's been writing, it's clear in that structure too.
So we have a couple of comments. Ian said the COG's involvement in Jin's comments in determining development ready criteria might be the way to go with the criteria. I heard that earlier in Kara's comments. This would be tailored to each individual region. And then Kevin mentions this is not an us versus them. It's a way to help support further smart, sustainable development. We're just trying to create a template. If there are holes in this, we need you to figure them out, and to fill them in before we advocate for this document at the state level. So yeah, I mean, yeah, but that's what we're doing. So that's great. So Nate says revenues to the state and local governments will be reduced in coming years. An affordable, scalable set of ideas will be received easier, and keeping limited funds in mind will help. There's an opportunity for local government to embrace change and implement localist ideas. Lots of great points. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about this framework, and I don't know how the financials end up working exactly, but you know, if we can start investing in projects that have a better financial return, you know, at some point, theoretically, that would help communities and the state, which, you know, there's just the transportation conversation is such a where we've so clearly overbuilt our infrastructure, and we can't seem to keep up with it no matter what we do. So, you know, and we've just invested in our town centers where we get the most financial bang for our buck. So if we flip that model on its head, where does that get us down the road? Hopefully in a better place. A couple more questions, Amanda.
Yeah. Okay. So Kevin says, if this is the responsibility that falls to the COGs, the state needs to financially support them, at least with the majority of their funding, not local governments. Tim says, effective land use is the foundation of economic development. Every time a piece of land is invested in, it affects, oh, sorry, I read that wrong. Every time a piece of land is invested, it affects the return on investment of all future activity within a community, region, etc. So is this a way to frame the discussion more effectively to secure resources? I think that goes to you, Kara. And then before you answer, Jim says he agrees with Nate's comment above. The local bootstrap approach requires fiscally balancing of development value versus infrastructure and service costing. Do you want to respond to Tim's question, Kara?
Well, I think that's just basically what I was saying before, that I think I agree. In terms of Kevin's comment, some past conversations with some folks at the COGS, so there are a couple on the phone, was that the COGS could play a role in the technical assistance piece of it, and that the funding that would be helpful for them would be to help fund that work. I don't know if anyone on the line, Shelley or trying to see if
I'm just thinking about our recent CDBG award
Harry.
and the COGS in that case, you know, that they as required, as I understand it by DECD, the COGS have to provide a recommendation on whether or not the municipality will receive funding for that. So I think, you know, potentially viewing the criteria as just as an option here, just as guidelines for a COG in that review process, so that you know, you can meet these criteria. I mean, the criteria are good. I think it's just I don't know if the criteria play out at a local level. They might play out at more of a regional level. That's just my suggestion.
Cool. So there are a couple more pages left in this document, which I can go through quickly, if that's helpful. Much left. Number 5 is recruitment and training, both for staff, planning board, councils, select boards. This is a topic that came up a lot during our systems mapping work, and just pretty broad agreement among participants of that process that giving people more resources to information, more access to information on the process of development would be helpful. And just an exciting little sidebar is that we've actually applied for some grant funding to try to put together some training materials for planning boards, select boards. And we're talking to MMA about that and some of the COGs as well. So hoping we can help support that work from multiple angles. And then the last piece is development ready sites. And this is following up on that work done during the comp planning process to identify where people want to see projects happen, identifying the sites, and putting together basic information cards on the sites that can then be put out onto the internet and the channels, network channels to try to get them into the hands of developers, local developers, so that can happen. And also, a side note on this one is we are working to try to put together a small scale developer training so that, you know, local people can be to do these projects. So communities aren't looking for, you know, the big developer to swoop in and save them. And this has been a strategy that's, you know, training local people to become developers is a strategy that's been working really well in other communities that, you know, don't have that kind of, you know, big market return that the larger developers are looking for. So,
Carrie, yeah, just following up on a couple of questions. There's been some agreements with Kevin's remarks on funding the COGS. And Jim says that COGS should be upfunded, not to be land use planners, but development support consultants. Additionally, you know, we wouldn't be planning for development, but we would be development planning. Tim says, what is the level of funding at municipality, county, and state level for economic development versus land use planning? Do we know? And then Rachel says, regional does seem like the scale at which the balance of readiness, criteria-based, can be negotiated. The towns with less regulation and less funding would have to be included as stakeholder communities as opposed to towns. Much like abutters are contacted for development, but with better social technologies to facilitate engagement. And George says, that sounds like a very workable approach to me. My town is very comfortable working with AVCOG. So, yeah, COGS for the win, I guess.
Well, I'll jump in here. Tireless Johnny, one note on COGS support and engaging existing regional infrastructure. We are making too many decisions in one town for the rest of the state, and we are too many towns to expect to build real strong consensus with any efficiency by doing it through all 430 whatever municipal units we have across the states. But with 6 EDDs, COGS, we have an opportunity to be working at a scale that is functional. They are owned by their own constituent municipalities. So the municipalities have a stronger, closer to home level of real authority, engagement, and representation, democracy. But they also function pretty well to think, and they were just redistricted within the last 10 years, to think really about the economic dynamics of their sphere. So some of the things that people have kind of alluded to or have come up in past discussions, how do you avoid low valued investment? How do you avoid duplication of investment that will compete with itself? Every town wants to get a CDBG grant for economic development program so they can build what Levesque used to call their own shitty little business park in their own town. If you look at these things at a regional level, you have at least an opportunity for the communities together that are neighbors, abutters, if you will, to think about how many of these little competing structures we want rather than more cooperative, efficient structures when it comes to making that investment and getting the proverbial return. So I'll pass off the soapbox now.
Yeah, so thanks, John. Vanessa says, Kara, can you please show an example of a rural towns development plan?
Sure. Yeah, there's been some past conversations I've had with a couple of people who have said, you know, changing from the way we do comp planning to development planning is really, you know, a big leap. Luckily, there's been some happening, so I can show, let's see, maybe. An example here.
So I'm just, sorry to interrupt, I'm cognizant it's 11:30, but if everybody could just stay on for a couple more moments so we can get this quick view of a rural.
Yeah, so this is Newcastle. They went through a comp plan process, and the planning work involved site-specific planning for parts of the town that people identified as their priority growth areas, essentially. The community came up with was this, which is, you know, it's both private development of new buildings along a street that the zoning had really promoted low density development. And this is right across the bridge from Damerskata, for those of you who are familiar with that area. And it also involves changes to the street itself. And so under the development ready community model, a town would go through this kind of process of figuring out what they want the place to look like. This is the main street that Newcastle says they want. And then they could submit for funding for street improvements and or building improvements to help fill the gap that exists between construction costs and rents, which I think is probably still real in Newcastle, because I know of at least one developer who has a project he'd like to do on the street and the numbers still aren't working. So that's the kind of work that could happen as part of the comp planning process that gets towns prepared to move forward. And again, I think, you know, someone asked earlier, what's the benefit of becoming a development ready community? And if we can do this right, I think what it can do is help make sure that plans that are specific like this, that do have really clear ideas for what the community wants, they don't just sit stagnant, that we can fill in the rest of the gaps that exist related to getting the funding in place for the street improvements and for the buildings to pencil by filling those gaps in financing for helping to do that. So.
Great. Just one last comment from Jim. In order to get upfunded, COGS should enter into agreement with the state to adopt, teach, train, review plans, and consult on the development readiness criteria. Then they become agents of the state and extend networks for system maintenance and advancement. Cool.
That's great.
So I guess in wrapping up, what are next steps, Kara?
Well, these are all great comments. I feel like I would like to understand a little bit more about the role people think the COGS could play and how to incorporate that into this draft so I can get that right. So I might get in touch with some of you who've made comments on the COGS. And then, you know, if anyone can provide comments on the PDF, if you're able to download it and mark up a PDF and send it back to me, I'm trying to incorporate people's comments as quickly as I can so I can get out another draft. I think we might try to have another call next week And, you know, if people generally think this is a good start of a framework for really organizing state and municipal relationships in a much more productive way and focusing on investment instead of just planning, I would appreciate, you know, any help getting more people to be a part of this conversation, so we can get more input, more ideas, and especially people at the state, if anyone is involved in the Climate Council or has connections with people in the Office of Innovation or I think we have planning here, but any, you know, DECD, other offices like that, please help spread the word and encourage people to take a look at this. And it's a lot to kind of process and read, but I appreciate everyone's time and looking through things and getting some feedback, because this is how we're gonna make it happen. So
yeah, and if anybody wants to distribute documents after this, you can email them over to me and I can send them out to all of the attendees if that's of interest. I will put my email address in the chat box. And then we do have a recording of this, so if you want to send it along to anyone else, I know it's a discussion, so it's probably more difficult to get through than just a regular webinar, but we will post it on our YouTube page. We're a little bit delayed. I need to post last week's as well. So be on the lookout for a Build Maine email. If you don't get them, sign up or just shoot me an email and I can put you on our list. And I think everybody's on there anyway, but and thanks again so much, everybody, for joining. Kara, what do we got next week?
well, I guess I would just say too, if people have additional questions after